Well, today we are nearing the end of our series on origins, the study of the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible that tells the origin story of God's relationship with humanity, and some of the early fathers and mothers of the faith, and some of the challenges that they faced, and some of the lessons that we can learn from their example, even if their examples were bad. And we're going to be looking at another one of those today. And the word that this whole episode centers around in is this word, trust. Who do you trust? Who is trustworthy? Who is not trustworthy? And so this is a fascinating story that I think is undertold and underdeveloped. Let me show a couple of photos that depict trust. That's either trust or that's pure terror. I'm not sure which. But you think about that. That's not just trust. That is prepared trust. Yes, there's trust there, but I'm sure that the instructions of the jump master were followed. I'm sure that the parachute packing was inspected. I'm sure that those two, before they jumped out of the plane, were as prepared as they could be before they exercised the trust of stepping out of a perfectly good airplane. Let's try again. Hang gliding. Now, in the first service, we had a couple of, is there anybody who has tried hang gliding? A few, okay. Hang gliding is another one of those that's a step of trust when you step off that cliff. But some preparation, significant preparation goes into that before you entrust yourself to the thermals and to the equipment and to the grace of God. Well, I'm the first to admit that there are degrees of trust. Each one of you today came into this room and you leaned over a chair and you placed your rear end in that chair and, sank down into it. And guess what? Was the trust in that chair well placed? I don't see anybody on the floor. So yes, that was a less dramatic, but another example of trust. There are lots of examples of trust in life. There are reasonable minor levels of trust. There are more moderate, and then there are the extreme trust that we saw in those photos. When I was 28 years old, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I have to admit, when the doctor gave me that news, it was not good news. The thing that bothered me most was that I was going to have to trust a pharmaceutical company every day for the rest of my life for my survival. Somebody was going to have to make my daily insulin. And I did not like that idea of I'm going to have to trust the Eli Lilly Corporation for the rest of my life to be able to live. I resisted that sense of dependency, that sense of having to trust somebody else. But it didn't take me more than about a day and a half to realize that my reaction was actually rather silly. I started thinking, at that time I had a house, I had a small garden in the backyard, and I thought, how much food can I grow in my garden? Not much. I'm already dependent on Safeway and King Soopers to feed me. I'm already dependent on Excel to keep me warm in the winter. I'm already dependent on Denver Water to be able to provide clean water to drink. Every time I go to a restaurant, I eat food prepared by somebody I don't know. Every time I drive my car, I am dependent on some unidentified factory worker who installed the brakes. Is adding Eli Lilly to the list really all that big a deal? We all live with trust every day. Well, this word trust is at the center of what the Bible says is one of the most important elements of our life. The Bible says in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Or another way of interpreting that, he will make your path straight. He will make clear the direction you should go. But this also is an exercise of trust. We trust not in our own cleverness, not in our own resourcefulness, but we trust in the Lord with all our heart. We recognize that there's more to life than what we have learned so far, and we are dependent upon that. Now, trust, however, does not come naturally to most of us, and for good reason. Not everything is trustworthy. Sometimes we are tempted to place our trust to depend on things that are not dependable. And today we're going to look at an often overlooked Bible story that shows us the difference between the trustworthy and the untrustworthy. It's in the last few chapters of the book of Genesis, and the main character is Joseph. We've already talked about Joseph in some earlier sermons in this series. Joseph was the favorite son of his father Jacob. Jacob provided him with an ornate coat that only he got. None of his 10 older brothers or his one younger brother, younger sister got anything like it. You can imagine how that made the other siblings feel. Not particularly fond of Joseph. He was also assigned by his father to be the inspector general of the siblings. Not a position that you want if you want to be liked. Jacob sent him off wearing his ornate coat to go see how his brothers were doing with the flocks of sheep and goats and camels and cattle. And he expected a full report from Joseph on how well the brothers were doing. You can imagine how that made the brothers feel. Privileged son comes out to be the inspector general. Well, as you know, when he got out there, the brothers saw an opportunity. They beat him up, they stripped him of the coat, they threw him in a cistern, and when some slave traders came by, they said, here's an opportunity. They sold him into slavery. Joseph was taken to Egypt. He was bought by a man named Potiphar. While he was there, Potiphar's wife takes an eye to Joseph. She tries to seduce him. Joseph refuses. He flees the house, but he is falsely accused, and he was thrown in prison on the false accusation of Potiphar's wife. While in prison, he again shows his trustworthiness. He becomes one of the trustees in the prison, overseeing some of the other inmates. And while he's there, he is given the opportunity to interpret dreams. Now, that's not anything he ever trained for, but he trusted the Lord, and he was able to accurately interpret dreams of two of the other inmates. When Pharaoh, the leader of the whole land, winds up with some mysterious dreams, one of those inmates whose dreams had been interpreted correctly remembers Joseph, recommends him to Pharaoh. Pharaoh calls in this inmate, asks him to interpret his dreams, and he does accurately. We don't have time to go into all the details, but as a result, he recognizes that Pharaoh's dreams are predicting 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. And he puts Joseph in charge of disaster prevention, preparing for the coming famine. And Joseph does that. He accumulates food while there are bumper crops. And then when the famine comes, he is prepared, and he saves not only Egypt but the surrounding areas. And sure enough, Jacob and the 12 brothers are hit by the famine too. They are starving up in Canaan. And when they realize that Egypt has plenty of food, 2 years into a 7-year famine, Jacob sends the 10 older brothers to go see if they can acquire some grain to survive on. And that brings us to today's incident. Amazingly, when the brothers show up, Joseph apparently is there, and he recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. He was dressed as an Egyptian prime minister. His brothers would never have predicted that. They weren't expecting that. They didn't recognize him. And it had been 17 years since they last saw him when he was a 17-year-old. Now he's in mid-30s. and he's in charge of food distribution for Egypt. We don't have time to go into the detail, but Joseph forces his brothers. He doesn't make it easy on his brothers. He wants to test them. He tests them to see if they are treating his younger brother the same way that they treated him. And when it's apparent that the brothers actually were protective of their younger brother, Joseph decides, okay, now I can give them the grain, and I can proceed with the great reveal. And so Joseph sends all of the Egyptians out of the room. It's just him and his 11 brothers at this point. And he reveals that he is their long-lost brother. And this is the passage where we are. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him. I wonder why. They were surprised, yes, but not only surprised, their worst dream had just come true. They thought that Joseph was certainly out for revenge, and now he was in a position to exact it to whatever degree he wanted to. His brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. The brothers thought they were toast. But Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me. Come on, group hug, group hug." He brings them close, and he tries to reassure them. When they had done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one, yes, you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Whoa. Joseph didn't stay just on the horizontal peer relation. He suddenly realized he's looking at this from a much higher point of view. He's recognizing God had purposes here that you peons couldn't possibly understand at the time, but something bigger was going on than you realized. "So then," he goes on, "it was not you who sent me here. You thought you were selling me into slavery. No, you were sending me on God's mission. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me.'" Now Goshen, or my grandmother used to have an expletive called land of Goshen. If she was, this is what it was referring to. Goshen was the pasture land in the delta, the Nile Delta, in the northern part of Egypt. It was lush. It was not good for building, because it was so water-soaked, it was not good for building pyramids, but it was good for raising livestock. And so Joseph sees that his family is able to settle in the land of Goshen. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. Joseph says, "I will provide for you there because 5 more years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute." Wow. With an offer like that, how can you refuse? He kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. Only then, after they realized, oh, there's a whole new scenario here that we never saw coming, were they able to talk with him. I wonder what those conversations were like. But this is a terrific and emotional reconciliation with his brothers. There's freedom for both Joseph here, who begins to understand the purposes, the inexplicable purposes of God in his own enslavement, his imprisonment, and the path of his life. And the brothers experience this kind of forgiveness. But note that this is Genesis 45. This would have been a wonderful place for the happy ending of the story. But Genesis has 50 chapters. There are 5 more chapters to go, and things get complicated even after this happy reconciliation. The next step is that Jacob did trust Joseph. Jacob was back in the promised land. He does come. He has a wonderful reunion with Joseph as well. He recognizes that Joseph is trustworthy, even though he didn't particularly want to leave his home. But he comes. And the Bible tells us that Jacob lives in Egypt for 17 years. Now do the math. Jacob arrives when the famine was in the second year. There were 5 more years of famine, so Joseph takes care of Jacob and his brothers and all of their families. There are more than 70 of them, so it's a big clan. They arrive. Joseph takes care of them for 5 years. Then after the famine, they stay there for another 10 years. And maybe there's good reason for that. Jacob is, approaching 140. He's old. The idea of traveling was not particularly pleasant for him. Okay, so they stayed there for 17 more years, and Jacob has a request before he dies. He goes to Joseph and says, "I'm about ready to die. I want you to do me a favor. I have a deathbed request. Please don't bury me in Egypt. Bury me in the land of my fathers, the land of Abraham and Isaac. I want to be buried there next to my wife, Leah." And so when he dies, Joseph is trustworthy. He takes the whole family back to the promised land. Even some of the Egyptian officials go and honor Jacob as he's buried in the promised land, the land of Canaan there. And so Joseph was trustworthy and did what his father had asked on his deathbed request. Interestingly, Joseph's brothers do not trust Joseph, who has proven himself trustworthy, at least to Jacob. When they get back to Egypt, the character of the brothers, their lingering guilt, and their inability to trust Joseph comes out. The brothers send word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died." And if you believe that, you need to be a little less trusting. Your father left these instructions before he died. "This is to what you say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Did he weep because he was so moved by their sincere words? I don't think so. He wept because even after he had taken care of them for 17 years, they still thought he was in it for vengeance. They still thought he was going to exact punishment on them for the way they treated him when he was a teenager. He's now in his 40s. The brothers are in their 50s, but they still are haunted by what they did when they were teens. Mercy. Joseph responds, "Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you?" Well, actually, in Egypt he was, but we'll overlook that. Yes, he could have punished them, but he chose not to. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people, including you. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children." So he reassured them. Joseph promises to keep supporting them and promises not to treat them harshly. Now, was this a favor? Was this godly generosity? Or did he wind up enabling complacency and manipulative behavior? I don't know the answer to that question. I'll let you decide as we look at the rest of this story. In hindsight, it appears he might have been just a bit too generous. Why? Because of the casual way the brothers handled their responsibility and their privilege. Here we move to the last chapter of Genesis, Genesis chapter 50. And here's what we read. "Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of his son Ephraim's children." So he was a great-great-grandfather. So there's 4 generations that he lived to see. And that's a very ripe old age. And so as he's approaching his death, he has, like his father, one request that he would like his brothers to handle. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. I don't want to be buried here. I want to be buried there in the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where I belong and where I was forced to leave, not by my own choice." And so Joseph made the sons of Israel swear. I'm sure some of his brothers, the Bible calls them brothers, they were probably the brothers and the brothers' sons and the brothers' grandsons by this point. But there were a couple generations there who swore an oath to Joseph to bury him in the land of his fathers, which was important to him. And so the next verse shows what they did with that promise. This is the last verse in the book of Genesis. "So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt." What had the brothers and their sons and their grandsons just had sworn an oath to do? To bury him where? In the promised land. When he died, where was he buried? In Egypt. This is the punchline of the whole book of Genesis. We follow Joseph's story from favorite son to slave to inmate to prime minister of Egypt, trusting God all along the way. He asks his brothers to swear an oath. They swear an oath that they will take him to the promised land. When he dies, he's buried in Egypt. Why do you end with that detail? Well, there's a couple of things I think we can take from this. Number one, Joseph entrusted his brothers who were not especially trustworthy, but even more, he was trusting God, who is trustworthy. Can God work with untrustworthy people? We're about to see that he does. Can you draw a straight line with a crooked stick? Well, if someone who's not the stick is holding the stick, yes. We have to admit that there are some extenuating circumstances here. But what's interesting is that even though the brothers did not fulfill their promise, well, we'll see you have to go into the book of Exodus to see how long they had to wait. It was 400 years. Joseph was buried in Egypt for 400 years. It wasn't until the time of Moses, 400 years later, that they eventually left Egypt. But what's significant here is how the New Testament looks back on this episode, on this last verse in Genesis, and how it is interpreted in the New Testament. Hebrews 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith, lists a number of the characters in the Older Testament and shows that they were people of faith. And when it comes to Joseph, what is the sign that Joseph was a person of faith? Was it the fact that he didn't give up when he was sold into slavery? Was it a fact that he resisted the seductive wife of his boss? Was it the fact that he was given grace to interpret dreams? Was it that he was a faithful steward of the produce of Egypt so he could feed people in a famine? No, none of those things. As good as they were evidence of Joseph's faith. This is what Hebrews 11 says. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. Genesis 50 is the sign that Joseph was a person who was trusting God. He had faith. He was living by faith even when he didn't see it in those around him. Joseph's brothers and his surviving family members did not do anything about his instructions. For generation after generation after generation, we wonder, what were you thinking when you took that vow? When were you planning to do what you vowed to do? It wasn't for well, we've already introduced the word quincentennial here. This was a quadcentennial. 400 years later that the people, the descendants, eventually got around it. But why didn't the family of Israel return to their land? Well, because Joseph's brothers did not trust God, who is trustworthy. Why did the sons and grandsons of Jacob stay in Egypt? At first, I suspect it was a longing for security. They had good pasture land. They liked it here. And we all know that moving is a hassle. If you move, that's not your favorite day. There's a lot of work, pain that's involved in that. Who wants to go through that? So they stayed where it was comfortable. Now, what happens when you don't trust God? What happened to the descendants of Jacob when they didn't do what they'd promised to do, when they didn't go where they knew they belonged? What finally made them leave 400 years later is that their desire for comfort, their desire for security, their desire for lush lands and big flocks had turned into what? Slavery. There had been a Pharaoh came along who did not remember Joseph. He just thought these people in Goshen would make great slaves, and so he enslaved them. And after this extended period of time, they were no longer able to do what they so readily vowed they would do, which is just easily get up and leave. It was going to require some supernatural effort that we see in the story of Exodus for them to do that. But they could have left freely any time up until the point that they became slaves. In some ways, this was a self-inflicted wound. Now, what do we learn from all of this? A few lessons. Number one, staying where it's safe because you don't trust God is dangerous. The pursuit of comfort, security, and having it my way because we don't want to do what we have promised to do and to trust God is actually a very dangerous position to be in. The search for famine relief. Nothing wrong with going to Egypt for famine relief. Nothing wrong with that. But over time, it can become disobedience. Seeking security can lead to slavery. There's no place more secure than living in obedience to God, and there's no place less secure than seeking safety apart from God's will. Second lesson, God remains trustworthy even when people don't. Sometimes you and I can be like Joseph, but sometimes we can also be like the brothers and not obey God, what he's told us to do and what we have promised. When we promise we will follow him, sometimes we take those words back. And eventually that disobedience leads to pain and suffering as God seeks to find us, to put us back on the right path. Perhaps it's easy in the morning when you wake up to fluff the pillow and roll over and stay in Egypt rather than getting up and reading the Word or listening to your audio Bible. I remember several years ago, I had an opportunity. There was a vendor that came to our office. I was talking with him, and during that conversation, he'd shared that one of his children had made some really bad decisions. It was now in a crisis situation, and I knew that God wanted me to pray with that man. But I'm sorry to say that I stayed in Egypt, and I didn't say a word. I just nodded. There's Egypt can woo us in a number of ways. You know, there's an old proverb that says to err is human and to forgive is divine, but St. Augustine paraphrased that and said, it's human to err, but it's devilish to remain willfully in error. By God's grace, since that time, I've had other conversations with people who've shared difficult situations, and I have been able to say, I think what God wants right now is for us to bring the situation to him. He is, yes, it sounds like a bad situation, but you know what? God is right here, right now, and he wants to walk with you in the middle of whatever the situation is. Let's entrust this to him, and let's depend on him and see what he does. And That's part of being faithful to God and not staying in Egypt. Number 3, trust isn't being gullible, but it's taking God at his word and acting on it. Doesn't have to be spectacular. It just means we are acknowledging God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understanding. Being able to say with your mouth or with your actions that I need an invisible means of support. This situation is more than I can handle on my own. I need God's help in this situation. That's part of what it means to trust God, to recognize that we're in over our head. And fourthly, trust means knowing your life's purpose extends beyond your lifetime. Your life, yes, affects those around you, but it also will affect those who follow you, just as Joseph's faith did. I like I'm a word nerd. The word authority comes from the word author. God's authority means that he's the author of your life story, and that doesn't end until we are with him face to face and we are with him in eternity. As God authors your story, as God's authority is made evident in your life, we can trust in that. We can recognize that God is working out a plan that's going to go far beyond your lifetime. One of my favorite historical heroes is a monk named Telemachus. He lived in the 300s, early 400s, and he'd taken vows to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, and for all his life until the very end, he'd lived in either a monastery or he'd lived in rural areas cultivating crops. In the year 404, he went to Rome for the first time, and he heard about the games in the Colosseum. And so he attended, but when he got there, he realized that the games were not games, but mortal combat between slaves, convicts, prisoners of war, and other gladiators fighting to the death. Telemachus was horrified. He was overcome. This was not what Jesus would want anyone to do. He jumped down from the stands, and he ran out into the arena between the gladiators, and he shouted, "In the name of Christ, forbear!" Forbear was his way of saying, stop, cease, desist. In the name of Christ, forbear. In the name of Christ, forbear. Well, when the crowd saw that he was trying to stop their entertainment, the crowd grew angry. I don't know if you've ever been, well, just about everybody who's gone to a professional football game or soccer games, you know how the mob mentality can kick in. When you see something you don't like, if there's a bad call, oh my, how that anger just rises up. Well, that's what happened in the Colosseum. When the crowd saw that he was trying to stop their entertainment, they grew so angry, it got really loud. They were screaming at him to leave, let him have their show. But Telemachus continued to insist in the name of Christ that the killing stop. The historical record isn't clear on who took the next step, whether it was a gladiator with his weapon or the crowd rushing the arena with stones, but we do know that Telemachus was killed right there in the arena. What happened next was interesting, though. Even the crowd realized that something tragic had just happened. The arena grew silent. A man who was representing Jesus, who only wanted to prevent needless killing, had himself been killed because of the cruel insanity of the crowd. That wound up being the last gladiatorial combat in Rome. Telemachus was willing to leave the comfort and safety of the stands to step into the arena to do what Jesus would have done, and Jesus honored his faithful obedience. Well, walking by faith means that we trust God. We trust him enough to follow him out of Egypt and all the way to the land where he lives, the promised land, where we live with him, and it's called the kingdom of God. It's doing God's will on earth and serving with him both now and in the life to come. I'd invite you to just reflect and ponder. What's your Egypt? What's tempting you to stay where you are, maybe not where you belong, but where you happen to find yourself? What's your Egypt? Is it a habit, a lifestyle, an addiction, some form of escape? Are you avoiding God's call to love, to serve, reach out to someone? Maybe today God is saying, you made a promise to follow me, to walk in my footsteps. What's holding you back? I'll be with you. Step out. Don't make the world wait 400 years to do something that you could take a step to do today. Take one step and then another. It doesn't require superhuman strength, but just acting in faith and trusting God. Jesus gave us an example to follow, and we're going to be taking communion now. And the elements I would like to suggest that we reflect on what Jesus' actions are freeing us to do by the fact that he died on the cross. His body and blood were spent for us, not so that we would live in comfort and security, but that we would be able to follow him into places where it takes some courage. So as we take communion, I would encourage you to ask, what is Jesus asking of me?